Hi, folks. We're just going to be starting in a minute, waiting for a few more people to log in, and we'll be ready in a sec. Welcome, everyone. We are so pleased to welcome you to the first event in our fall webinar series. Thank you for joining us from your respective locations across the country. We appreciate your time and especially everything that you do for our students, your students, and we are here to support you in any way we can. My name is Miriam Ramesh. I am NLP Senior Manager of Education and Training. I'll be giving John a hand in facilitating this session. I just want to remind you here that you have registered for the entire series, which will be happening every Tuesday in October at 5 p.m. Eastern, 2 p.m. Pacific. So make sure you save the dates. You will be receiving a reminder from Zoom in the meantime. And to answer the most burning question you likely have, we will be sharing the recording after each webinar, along with a PDF of the slide deck. So keep an eye out on an email that will be coming later in the week, which will also include a link to download a certificate of participation in case you have the ability to get professional development credit for it. We are also going to be sharing links and free resources. So definitely follow, keep an eye out for that email. We are really glad you're here. I want to give a huge shout out to Smart News, which has made this program possible thanks to their support. And we are able to give it to you for free. Our format, just so you know, we're allotting 60 minutes for the session, and we have an optional 30-minute Q&A at the end to make sure we're able to address all the questions you have. We also have a couple of pause points throughout the session where we will answer questions that are very specific to the hefty amount of information we'll be sharing with you guys. Oops. Okay, did not mean to go forward. Here we go, chat and Q&A. So I would like to make sure that you guys take a peek at this. I know everybody is probably an expert at Zoom at this point, and I am really sorry for that, the circumstances that has made that possible. But speaking of questions, you're going to see us popping related links into the chat. And also for some of the questions, we are joined tonight by my amazing colleagues from the Ed team, Peter Adams, And we have Hannah and Susanna and also Jordan, which some of you may have already met if you're familiar with NLP. A quick reminder is that you are muted, and take a peek at the Q&A and the chat icons on your screen. For the chat, you have an opportunity to Slack message just the panelists, or you can share your comment with everyone. So there's a drop-down box there. Make sure you take a peek at that and address your questions in the Q&A chat box, where we will be spending our time. So thank you, everyone. We will record this session. If you have just logged on and missed that, that session, it will be recorded. You'll be able to view it later. We will make the PDF available, and you'll be receiving an email later in the week with additional goodies. So we are grateful for the work you do and want to respect your time. So let's get to it. John, I will pass it to you.
All right, thank you so much, Miriam. And welcome everyone. Thank you very much for taking some time out of your incredibly busy schedules to spend some time with us. This is the first session in our fall webinar series about what it means to be news literate. This session is an introduction and an overview of many of the key concepts and learning objectives of teaching news literacy. And as you notice from the descriptions, the additional sessions in this series will go into much greater detail with some of the concepts that I'm going to introduce tonight. So my name is John Silva. I'm part of the education team here at the News Literacy Project. I'm responsible primarily for professional development and training in the field of news literacy. I'm a former classroom teacher. I spent 13 years as a social studies teacher in Chicago public schools. And one of the areas that I spend a lot of time is researching trends in misinformation, and particularly in conspiracy theories. You'll see that my email address is here on the slide if you have any questions you want to follow up with me directly. And I am also very active on Twitter, sharing resources, ideas, and things relating to many of these topics. And that is my handle there. So if you are active on Twitter, go ahead and give me a follow and we can keep the conversation going. One of the things that I always want to start with to frame a lot of this is that at the News Literacy Project, we believe that news literacy education is a right for young people. And teaching it is absolutely essential across grade levels and subject areas. This is primarily because when we talk about civic literacy, civic engagement, being reliably informed and the information that you consume and engage with is critical to being an active and engaged citizen. As a colleague, Mary Ellen Daniels, said earlier today, information is the currency of democracy. And part of this is also, as I think, as we're seeing in a new way, this complex information landscape that we are engaging with now, especially with so many people doing remote learning and learning new technologies. Students need to be able to navigate this complex information landscape. And if we don't do this, like if we don't prepare them for this, for how to navigate this, for how to be reliably informed, we are doing them a disservice, and we have to prepare them. And it's up to teachers from possibly as young as 3rd grade across subject areas. And you'll see, hopefully, where these concepts will connect to your curriculum. So what do we mean by news literacy? So there's a couple of key points about what news literacy is. One of the most important is that it's really about being able to determine credibility of not just information, but also sources of information. Being able to understand what's reliable, what's not, how to verify information for yourselves. And a key aspect of this is about the standards of quality journalism. What we say is the authoritative, fact-based journalism and professional journalists that are out there trying to inform us so that we know what we can trust, what we can reliably and ethically share, and what information to act on. But it's also about being able to interact with the news, being able to not just be a consumer, but someone who is able to learn and understand and engage in particular discourse and talking about current events and things that are happening in social and political issues. So I wanted to give you a brief overview and sort of highlight some of the ways that why this is really important. So I'm going to show you several examples. All of these are from recent issues of the SIFT, our weekly newsletter, which if you're not a subscriber, we'll share a link towards the end where you can subscribe. So this is a tweet that actually from a verified account of a person running for Congress in Oregon, sharing these unverified rumors and bordering on conspiracy theories about the fires that were happening, particularly in Oregon, claiming that these Antifa arsonists were responsible for it. And this is a completely false rumor. Another example is this image that has been taken completely out of context to create false information. So this is originally an image, a photo that was taken of clouds over Hawaii 2 years ago, but it was repackaged, repurposed to sort of suggest that this is a view of the California wildfires. Now, we may not think of this as sort of dangerous misinformation, but it's a certain type of false context that we need to be able to recognize when something is true or not, even if the photo is real. But also a great deal of this is political in nature. Obviously, there was a video that was taken out of that was selectively edited to show what appeared to be former Vice President Biden waving to an empty field. Whereas if you had seen the full clip, you would realize that there were actually people out there. But what was interesting is around the same time, there was another selectively edited video, this time of President Trump, that was actually about 2 years old, that was trying to suggest that he was just wandering around aimlessly and staring at a puddle, when in reality, he was waiting for the First Lady to meet him outside. So these types of misinformation, we encounter them in so many different ways. But one of the things I want to emphasize is that we shouldn't focus on the platform, right? We shouldn't just say this is a Twitter problem or a Facebook problem. Misinformation, propaganda, and conspiracy theories come at us across so many different channels, even offline. And the skills that we're going to be talking about apply to the content of the information and the source of that information, not necessarily the platform. So when we think about this, we really want to focus on these skills, which can be applied to any source of information. So one question I want you to think about, thinking about your own students, the students that you work with, if they saw these and decided that they wanted to Google it, what would they find? And would they be able to critically evaluate the information that they got in those search results? Because it comes to this most important essential question for the work that we do with the News Literacy Project, which is about, can your students tell the difference between fact and fiction? Many of you probably would say maybe not necessarily, but hopefully by the time you're done with our professional development and using some of our resources, you'll be able to confidently say that yes, your students can. So I'm going to jump into some of the skills, and you'll see that these are sort of framed as learning objectives. And as Miriam mentioned, I will pause at a couple of points for questions. So one of the first that we want to emphasize with young people is that having an emotional response to information is many times a warning sign that what you're seeing may not be reliable. So this is an example. After the president announced that he had been diagnosed with COVID-19, this fake email solicitation was making the rounds on Twitter in particular, suggesting that the Trump campaign was trying to pander and raise campaign money off of this. And you can imagine the type of emotional responses that people had to this. And it's that emotional response that makes you want to just react and share rather than taking a step back and really thinking about it. Because misinformation is about using our emotions to manipulate us. That emotional response, the stronger it is, the more that it overrides our rational thought processes. Now, most adults, when we see something, we tend to recognize that emotional response, and we do hopefully pause. But the thing is that misinformation wants us in that emotional response to simply react, to share it, to retweet it, to comment on it, without really pausing and thinking. So it's that rapid response. And one of the things that I always try to emphasize is that adolescents are particularly vulnerable to this when we think about adolescent brain development, right? The executive functions, the judgment, those things, those rational thought processes are the last parts of the brain to develop, and they're usually not fully developed until the early to mid 20s. So when we're talking about adolescents and preteens, they're really only using the emotional centers of their brain. So they are very vulnerable to misinformation. And so this is something we want to emphasize, is that when they have this response, they are being manipulated by misinformation, by propaganda, and even by conspiracy theories. And we also want to emphasize that these emotions cover the range, right? So there could be a lot of misinformation that makes us anger, it makes us fearful of something, but it could also be some types of misinformation that make us laugh, or just have that wow moment. So it's not, so there isn't just any one emotional response, but it is in that emotion that we react, and we really want to have a way for young people to pause and then think and evaluate before they move on. We will be going into a lot more detail on misinformation in webinar 2 next week on the 13th. We'll be talking a lot about not just the emotional reaction, but about why misinformation goes viral, some of the motivations behind why people create it, why people share it. We'll also talk about an important aspect of online civic engagement, which is how to effectively debunk misinformation. So if you're registered for today's webinar, you're registered for all 4. Another really essential skill that we want to emphasize with young people is about the differences between news and opinion. And this is something that a lot of adults struggle with, because when we look at the sheer amount of information that's available online or on our television networks, it's really difficult sometimes to see the differences. And so the way we break it down is to think that news informs and opinion persuades. So news is about those standards of quality journalism. It's about following those processes to make sure that we're being informed, following those ethical standards of quality journalism. Whereas with opinion pieces, it's all about trying to present only the information that furthers a particular viewpoint. And it's really not asking us to go deep into evidence of opposing viewpoints. So opinion is really is all about persuasion. So when we talk about news and we talk about the standards of quality journalism, these are the basic standards. So news should be verified by the journalist, by the news organization, using multiple quality sources that are providing that information. And that information is being presented in a way that is as what we call fairness. So if we're reporting on something that is critical, say, of a politician, that person should have an opportunity to respond. And news organizations need to be very open and accountable for what they put out. So an example I like to use is that when the Washington Post reports on something relating to Amazon, they will remind people that the Washington Post is owned by Jeff Bezos, who also owns Amazon. And with transparency, when reputable journalists and news organizations make a mistake, they own up to it. They correct mistakes, and they issue that corrections. And unfortunately, there's a general perception that somehow making those mistakes is a negative. Where people are human, people are fallible, they make mistakes, but reputable news organizations will correct it and own it. And that's actually a sign of a very reputable organization. But also context is very important in a news story. We have to have as much background and detail about a news event so that we can fully understand it. And in some ways, recognizing opinion is the opposite of that, right? Because we don't necessarily have fairness. We don't have a lot of, maybe things aren't always verified. We have selective sourcing. But hopefully we also recognize that in a reputable organization, opinion pieces are properly labeled. They will say this is an opinion piece. This is a comment, this is commentary or an editorial. It will be written differently. A lot of types of opinion pieces are written in the first person. And then that persuasive language is also very key to recognizing opinion. Another aspect, another really important skill and learning objective is about recognizing whether or not something that's being shared with us has evidence to support the claim. So I'm going to show you, these are 2 examples from our brain training style app, Informable, which talks about things like this. So when you see something like this, when you look at this image and you look at the content of the tweet, this person is trying to suggest that not a single Democrat showed up to this committee meeting. And you can see all the empty chairs are are circled there in red. And the reality is that if we just accept this at face value, we might think that it's true, but this person actually hasn't provided any evidence to say that this, this image is actually from this committee meeting that it happened during. So it's really just making this claim, and we really don't have a way of sort of evaluating it on its face. Whereas this example from the Pew Research Center, they're making this claim about people identifying as politically independent, but it does two really important things that make it very different. The first is that it shows us the data from this chart so that we can see the data. But if we click on the link, it also takes us to an article that explains more detail. It gives us a lot of information about the context of the study and goes into a lot more detail. So we have evidence to evaluate for this claim. And one of the things that I want to call back to when we look at the differences is that sometimes if we're having an emotional response to something, that could be an indicator that we are being manipulated. Maybe there is not evidence to support it, and it's trying to get us to accept something at face value when we really should evaluate it a little bit more critically. And this brings up some questions that we want to teach young people to try to ask as they're evaluating these things. So these are all questions that have been adapted from the Stanford History Education Group Civic Online Curriculum. If you're not familiar with the SHEG, they have a lot of great resources specifically for this. But these are some questions that young people should think about and try to get answers to help them determine whether or not something is credible, whether or not the evidence is credible, the source and whatnot. And the reality is we want them to continue asking these questions until either, the answer is clearly no, there is no credibility, or yes, it is credible and I can believe it. And so this is part of that critical reasoning that we want young people to engage with as they're going through information. And this connects to some very important fact-checking skills that we want to build into the curriculum when we're teaching these skills. So one of the first, also from the Stanford History Education Group, is called lateral reading. So Sam Weinberg and Sarah McGrew from the Stanford Graduate School of Education did a lot of research in this, and they developed this process, what they call lateral reading, which is effectively verifying something while you're reading it. But the idea is that you need to get off of what you're reading. You need to read laterally by opening up a new browser tab and trying to verify the details, answering those questions through a very detailed Google search. And you keep searching and you keep looking at multiple sources until you have a level of confidence in what you're reading, or your confidence is so low that you can just stop and disregard it. So I'm going to go back to this tweet from Paul J. Romero Jr. about evaluating this. So we can Google him, but one of the things we really want to do is to start with the claim. So we need to think of lateral reading as deliberate, effective search strategies, right? We don't want to just Google random terms. We want to search effectively, and then we want to evaluate the results of that search very carefully using what's called click restraint. We don't want to just click on the first link. We want to look through all the results and then choose them carefully to find the ones that we think might be most relevant and most reliable. And again, keep searching until we have a high level of confidence. So here's an example about evaluating this one. I entered some key details from the post from that original tweet. And when I looked at the search results, one of the first one that pops up is a fact check from PolitiFact. One of the things that search engines have gotten very good at with their search algorithms is recognizing if it thinks you're trying to do a fact check and prioritizing results from fact checking organizations. But we can see underneath it that there are some news stories related to it. But if we continue to scroll down, one of the things that shows up on that first page of results is actually a link to the original false claim tweet. And so this emphasizes why it's really important to look at the results very closely and very carefully before you click on them. Another fact-checking tool that's very important to teach young people is the reverse image search. A reverse image search, if you're not familiar with it, it's a very specialized type of search that takes an image and tries to match the pixel patterns of that image to other images in their search database. And it will try to match it or show images that it thinks are similar. Three of the most common ones and most popular ones are Google Images, TinEye, and Yandex. And we'll have some links to those for you so you can check them out. And there are multiple ways to search this, but I'm going to show you one of the shortest, one of the easiest. So you may have seen this image that went viral shortly after the death of Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. So this tweet went out with this image trying to suggest that NBA players were wearing these T-shirts with the lace around the collar, paying respect to Justice Ginsburg. So what you do with a reverse image search is you put your cursor over the image and you right click, and it pops up a search menu. You can see here it says search Google for image. Whichever browser you're using, they all have this feature built in depending on the browser and your default search engine, but mine is set to Google. And you can see from the results that pop up, it gives me a recommendation of a possible related search, which says NBA Black Lives Matter shirt. And these first two, these two sites that pop up are trying to find somewhat of a relationship between the image and images that appear on these pages, so that it has what it thinks are matching images. But if we go down, it's going to show us a lot of the images that it found that are closely matched. And you can see the very first one in the upper left-hand corner is nearly identical, except instead of having the lace, it says Black Lives Matter. And so we're starting to get a sense that this image may not be right. But then when we go down further, we see pages that include matching images. One of them is a fact check that it could be most relevant to what we're looking for, but a lot of these are simply talking about the NBA and Black Lives Matter. But if we go down a little bit further, we actually see a link to a source here, the Babylon Bee, which says that they're wearing special lace collars. And it's actually a satirical website. And one of the things that I want to emphasize in this as a related topic is that satire is in fact a type of misinformation, because it is trying to sort of manipulate us usually through humor. But one of the things that's important to know is that even though the content comes from a known satirical source, sometimes satire can be shared out of context. And we still need to verify the information as closely as we can, so that once we know that it's verified, once we've been able to verify that it's satire, we know that we can just sort of move on. And so these two tweets actually emphasize how that satire can be taken out of context. So the original tweet with the original satirical article from the Babylon Bee, you see it on the left. And then this person just took the image and then tweeted out as part of this claim. And it makes no reference to the Babylon Bee, it makes no reference to the satire. So he's just sharing it as if it's a real image. Whereas, and if you go to the account of the Babylon Bee, you can actually see it says fake news you can trust, and you can sort of see from there that it is a satirical website. You don't have to only use a browser. There are apps that you can download for your phone that will do a reverse image search from your mobile device. The one that is sort of in orange, it says multi-reverse image search, is one that I actually use on my Android device. It will search Google, TinEye, and Yandex. Many of these are very highly rated. You can find them on the Google Play Store. You can also find them on iTunes. So you don't have to just use a browser. You can also take a screenshot or download an image on your phone and do a reverse image search from there. So I'm going to take a pause here because I threw several key points at you very quickly, but I'm going to see if are there any questions about fact checking or about any of the initial learning objectives that I mentioned. Just going to pause to see if anybody has any new questions.
Just a reminder, folks, to make sure you add your questions to the Q&A box instead of the chat.
Okay, it doesn't look like there are any open questions in the Q&A. Are there any resources you have that show journalists talking about fact checking? I don't have any of those resources with me at hand, Miranda, but we can try to send those out to you in a follow-up about fact checking sites. Okay, I'm going to continue. We will be going in webinar 3 on October 20th. My colleague Peter Adams is going to be doing a deep dive into digital verification, going into some more advanced fact checking verification tools, but he will also be talking about how to use fact-checking and verifications to create really engaging student activities to really encourage them to learn the skills and how to apply it in their day-to-day information consumption. So that's going to be a deep dive into that on webinar 3 on October 20th. Okay, so I'm gonna talk a little bit about bias here because this is a tricky topic that we want to talk about. But I'm going to sort of introduce this by showing you some headlines, and I'm going to post a couple of poll questions to sort of see what you think about these headlines and thinking a bit about bias. So this is the first headline. It says USS Theodore Roosevelt commander relieved of duty. So I'm going to launch this question. And so the question is simply, do you perceive bias in this headline? Okay, looks like we have about 44% are saying no. I'll share the results here in just a second. I'll give it another 10, 15 seconds to see if we can get everyone to answer the question. Okay. So this is the results from this first one. So 44% of you said no, there is no bias in this. And then 36% possibly, 20% said yes. Okay, so what I'm gonna do now, I'm gonna show you a second headline, same event, and there will be a follow-up question to that. So this one says, Navy removes aircraft carrier captain who raised alarm about coronavirus response. So the question here is this headline more biased, less biased, or about the same as the first? And I'll give about 30 seconds for everyone to answer. Okay. Looks like we still have a few people voting. Okay. So this one, about almost half of you indicated that this is more biased than the first, and then about evenly split between less and about the same. Okay, I'm going to show you one more, also from the same news event. Commander of aircraft carrier hit by coronavirus removed for poor judgment after sounding alarm. So thinking about the first two and then this one in context, is this one more, less, or about the same, possibly somewhere in between? Okay. So this one was pretty definitive. Seems 60% think that this one is more. So one of the things that we want to talk about when we discuss headlines. So one of the questions, the way I asked the question is about perception. So thinking about these three headlines, I want you to just sort of think for a second about which one you think is the most biased and think about why you think it is. And so the difficult thing is that talking about perception is very different than actually trying to have an objective way of talking about bias. A lot of people will, as Lawrence mentioned, a lot of people will look at in headline 3 about the quoted term poor judgment, a lot of people will point to that to indicate that that is showing some sort of bias. But when we talk about this, we want to get to a more objective way of talking about bias, especially when we talk about news media bias. And because there are some questions that we have to ask before we pass judgment. So one of the first things is that, are these headlines, are they straight news pieces? And are they from standards-based news organizations? Because if these are actually commentary pieces, opinion, or even propaganda, then having a discussion of bias is kind of pointless, because they're by their nature supposed to be biased. And another question, if we determine they are straight news pieces, are they factual? Are they accurate? So that third headline with the quote, that could actually be the stated reason why that captain was removed from duty. And if we're talking about it, can we explain the type of bias that we're perceiving? And then also a moment of self-reflection, like, are we projecting our own biases onto this evaluation? So I want to show you the sources for these three headlines. And I'm showing you the sources now as opposed to the beginning, because this raises one of the most important things, is about confirmation bias. I think it's fair to say that for most of us, if I had shown you the logos of the news organizations where I got these headlines from, that would have changed how you perceived bias in that headline, because of how you perceive that news organization. Because generally people, there is the perception is that Fox News is fairly conservative, CNN tends, and Washington Post tend to be more liberal, depending on how you view these things. So the thing is that these are all factual headlines. Different news organizations have different standards for how much they include in their headlines, how much detail, how much context. And as I'll show you a little bit later on, having context in the headline and in the lead is actually very important to how we will sort of perceive a news story. So one of the ways that we do teach this, we have a lesson in our Technology virtual classroom called Understanding Bias. We break it down into 5 types of bias that we would apply to straight news pieces, looking at these 5 types. Our lesson goes through these. And then we also talk about forms. So the types and the forms, they interact and create lots of different combinations for the way bias can be expressed in different types of news stories. And so these types and forms are how we would approach this, to trying to get to that more objective way of talking about bias with students. So when we're talking about this, there is a temptation sometimes to use these media bias charts that are very common out there. And they are updated somewhat regularly. But if we're talking about straight news and we're trying to talk about an objective way of measuring bias, there are some challenges to these charts. A lot of times they emphasize the orientation of the columnists, the opinion writers, and somewhat even just perceptions of the general public about those news organizations. The other problem is that in a lot of ways, we're comparing apples and oranges. Some of the organizations on these charts are standards-based news organizations that publish news and opinion pieces, whereas some of them are only about opinion and commentary, and sometimes even outright political propaganda or even misinformation. And they are very subjective. And so if we want to get to an objective way of measuring bias, we have to try to remove as much subjectivity as we can. And they are in a lot of ways an oversimplification, because bias is a very complex topic. It is very difficult sometimes to talk about it objectively. And if we just simply exclude sources based on a chart like this, we are really discouraging critical evaluation of sources. So I'm going to pause on that one, because I know that's a dense topic, and that's usually one that brings up a lot of questions. So I'm going to see if what kind of questions we have here. Okay, so at one point I said misinformation, propaganda, or conspiracy. Do I see those existing on a spectrum? I think in a lot of ways, conspiracy theories in particular, they do exist somewhat on a spectrum. One example I would talk about would be like with people who are anti-vaccine. There are some people who are very extreme in their opposition to vaccines and do sort of go into conspiracy theory type thinking, whereas some people who are more vaccine hesitant might not be as deep into it. So for example, some people generally are in favor of vaccines, but maybe don't feel confident about getting a flu shot, for example. So some of them do exist on a spectrum, but one of the things about misinformation in particular is that we have to recognize that it's at its very basic level, misinformation is binary, right? That it's something is either true or it's not. And I see that, Peter, did you want to chime in on that question?
No, on the spectrum question?
Yeah.
No, I flagged it
Okay.
answer live because you were in the process of addressing it. Yeah.
Cool. So in some ways, there is misinformation and propaganda that can be more extreme in terms of how it presents false information or uses false information. But in some ways, misinformation, if it gets the worse it gets in terms of how it uses information, can devolve into a conspiracy theory. So Natalie asked, do I recommend avoiding bias charts or entirely, or using them to highlight the potential issues? I think we can use them, but we have to be careful about how we're using them, right? Because if we want to evaluate political viewpoints, they can be very good for evaluating, the political leanings of different organizations. But if we're trying to evaluate news and looking at those standards of quality journalism, they are very difficult to sort of push through. So it kind of depends on how you want to use them. Some of them are getting very good at differentiating between the news content and the opinion content of different news organizations. Nadine, should we ask students to look for more context in headlines? Yeah, headlines can be very tricky. And one of the things I'm going to mention towards the end is about we shouldn't make judgments about a news article based solely on the headline. I'm really going to emphasize that in a little bit. Okay. Bias can show up as a lack of information. Sharon Wiggins asked, bias can also show up as a lack of information, as in the Fox News headline. One of the things that we want to ask about that, though, is about the standards about how an organization writes and publishes headlines, because in some cases, a news organization might focus on brevity, only putting out the most essential information in the headline, whereas others their standards are more about giving additional context in that. So you could, but we really have to think about what are the standards for writing headlines for a news organization.
It also addresses Nadine's about asking students to look for more context in a headline.
So Renee Blackman, how do journalists account for misinformation that comes about in the rush to get the story out? I'm actually going to ask my colleague, Susanna Gonzalez, who I think is still on, or if not, maybe Hannah Covington. They are both professional journalists who have extensive journalism experience. I'm going to see if maybe one of them wants to answer that question, which is, how do journalists account for misinformation that comes about in the rush to get the story out?
Hi, thanks for the question. This is Susanna. It's definitely a challenge, especially in fast-moving stories, breaking news stories, to verify any information, any bit of information on urgent deadline. But it's part of the job. And we do that by asking more questions, repeating questions, and asking more questions, and just pressing the source to get the answer that journalists are looking for. I hope that helps.
Great, thank you, Susanna. Okay, I'm going to move on. We do have another Q&A. We will have some time for Q&A again towards the end to get to some of these other questions. And again, just a reminder, our final webinar of the series, Understanding Bias, a Nuanced Approach to this News Literacy topic, again with my colleague Peter Adams, but I believe also Susanna will be joining him. We're going to do a deep dive into bias and really thinking about how we can empower students with how to evaluate bias in a meaningful, objective way. Okay, so we're talking about headlines. This is absolutely an important skill that I think a lot of us need to try to practice more, is that when we see the links that are posted, we have to click on them and read them. So here's an example that I used to illustrate this. So this is from 2016. Ronda Rousey, former MMA fighter, posted this link to an NPR article saying, "Why doesn't America read anymore?" And one of the interesting things is that when you look at the comments, the replies to her tweet, you can see people have very strong opinions about why people don't read anymore, right? Talking about buttercup Americans, it's a sad state of affairs, nobody respects the value of a library anymore. But the reality is, had any of them clicked on the article, they would have realized that it was an April Fool's joke published by NPR. And they actually have published it several times over the years in the same way. And it's one of those things that still gets shared. You know, people will see the headline, they'll have an opinion, and they'll comment on it. And what's interesting is that you'll also see people arguing about it in the comments, and not very few of them realizing. Now, this one, a lot of people realize that it's April Fool's joke, but this is actually a major problem. There was a joint study by Columbia University and the French National Research Institute. They were actually specifically looking at links on Twitter. And they actually discovered that 59% of the links that were shared on Twitter, people never actually clicked on them, but people were engaging with the article and in the comments and engaging with each other, talking about the article long after that initial post. They kept replying to each other and commenting on it and sharing it, and they never even read it. So going back to those headlines and thinking about this was earlier this year, this news story popped up on social media. You can see here that there was a bill proposed in Vermont that would ban cell phones for everyone under the age of 21, right? This is from ABC News. This is from their official Twitter account. Likewise, same story on CNN. It says Democratic State Senator John Rogers proposed this bill and quotes him as saying, cell phones are just as dangerous as guns. A total ban on cell phones for anyone under the age of 21. And likewise with that, people had opinions, right? Some people were saying, you know, the kids have no business with phones, questioning what's their reason, talking about the nanny state and government overreach. But the reality is, had they read the article, they would have discovered that he had actually proposed this bill as a protest against what he felt was Vermont's overreaching gun control laws. And in every news story mentioned that in the context of the story. But one example here you see on the right, my NBC5 actually has that context in the headline and the lead, whereas others simply omitted that from their headline and that. So this really emphasizes the critical need to click those links and to read the articles, and why you shouldn't make decisions about a news story based solely on the headline. Okay, so I'm going to pose some questions to you, which I'm hoping you can use in your planning and thinking about how you might start to integrate news literacy into your curriculum. It will also set up some things for you to think about in the follow-up webinars that we're going to do in this series. So thinking about these skills and these concepts and the knowledge, how does this connect to your specific curriculum? You know, there's a lot of social studies teachers who are already doing news literacy, but hopefully you will see how it can apply across many different disciplines and subject areas. Because being able to question sources, question evidence, looking at that and being able to prioritize information connects across many subject areas and grade levels. And that cross-curricular opportunities, we can really see an opportunity where these news literacy skills can support one another when we're trying to teach the same students across those subject areas. And likewise, we want to think about news literacy as something that is scaffolded through the grade levels. A lot of research has come out in recent years that advocates that we can start doing some of this as early as 3rd grade. And actually my son, who's now in 5th grade, he actually brought home a lesson from Junior Scholastic that was talking about fake news. I did see in the Q&A, somebody asked about the term fake news. We absolutely should try to stop using that term because it is overly broad and it really oversimplifies a very complex problem. And one of the things that we do talk about is how to talk about misinformation without using this catch-all term. So just to summarize about the mission of the News Literacy Project and what we're trying to do, I hope you sort of see the connections between this idea that young people have a right to news literacy education and that these concepts and knowledge and skills are so vitally important for them to learn. Okay, so I'm going to pause again to see if there are some additional questions. Is there a good list of reputable news sources that are generally reliable to guide students towards? You know, I don't know that we necessarily have such a list. One of the things that we try to emphasize in teaching young people is for them to evaluate news organizations and journalists individually in a lot of ways using those standards of quality journalism. But there are a lot of reputable news sources out there. But one of the things we also want to emphasize is not just limiting yourself to one or two. Think about how you can get news from a variety of sources. Let's see. Any other questions that are open? I answered that one. So Mary Robb says, we do an activity with our students that asks them to consider what information has been left out of a news story. Is this useful? I think that it can be useful, but one of the things that's most important though is if you can identify information that's been left out of a news story, then that's actually a red flag that the journalist may have omitted essential context or details to a news story. If information has been left out, it is useful to sort of question why. So that is really something important to think about. But we want to be careful that about what it is how we're asking that question, because we don't want to sort of think of it in terms of being cynical that information is always left out. But if we can identify information that has been, that's something to think about. Nadine, I'm struggling with how to teach conspiracy theories, QAnon. Where do you think we should start? So actually I have a piece of very good news for you and everyone's that we're actually in the process of developing a Czechology lesson on conspiracy theories and conspiratorial thinking. That's going to be launching sometime early next calendar year. But I think if you want to get started now, focus on conspiratorial thinking more than an actual conspiracy theory itself, because there are things like motivated reasoning and being selective in evidence and sort of the cognitive dissonance that happens in conspiratorial thinking, but also a little bit of maybe looking at the psychology of why people tend to believe them. I think that's a good place to start without going into some of the darker conspiracy theories. But if we talk specifically about QAnon, there are a lot of stories out there where news organizations have been trying to inform people about what QAnon is, how it got started, why it's dangerous. But I would be fairly cautious about that until you sort of talk about why people tend to believe it first. Bonnie Parks asks, I need to teach a class on misinformation to low-level high school students. Do you have a suggestion? Yes, actually we do. So in the Czechology virtual classroom, which we will share a link to in a second, we do have a lesson that is specifically about types of misinformation and being able to recognize them. So you'll be able to look at that. Let's see. Will you be addressing the way the news covers the election and all that entails? We are looking to work with our students on pausing their curriculum to address and cover the events. We don't necessarily have something like that in the Czechology virtual classroom. However, on our website, newslit.org, we will be sharing a number of resources that will talk a bit about election coverage. However, there are a number of other resources out there that are doing similar work, and we'll try to see if we can come up with some of those to share with you. Okay, can this apply? So Christina Nguyen asked, can this be applied to science, especially with COVID? Absolutely. There is so much misinformation and conspiracy theories and even political propaganda about COVID-19. Applying these news literacy standards to science news and how we report on it, but also about, who it is that's publishing information relating to health and science and safety and all that. You absolutely can apply that to COVID-19. And we actually have a COVID-19 guide in the Czechology virtual classroom, which we can also share with you. Okay. I'm going to share some resources very quickly, just so we can get through them so you can see what we have that will help. So we have a number of resources specifically for educators. Hopefully many of you have already seen the Czechology virtual classroom. We have our weekly newsletter, The Sift, which is it comes out on Mondays. It's a weekly roundup of essential topics and trends and misinformation and things like that. We have professional development and NewsLitCamp. So this is one example of the professional development that we do. Our website has a new educator resources library, and we also are launching a national news literacy educator network. So if you're interested in checking out Czechology, go to get.checkology.org. It is completely free for you and is completely free for your students to have their own accounts. And you can explore the resources that we have there and how to include that in your learning with your students. Here's the website for our educator library, newslit.org/educators/resources. We have them broken down into different grade bands, and we have different types of lessons and activities. And our education content team is hard at work trying to develop additional resources. So you'll find a lot of things available for you here. Here is how you can subscribe to the SIFT. Again, it is that real-time teachable moments that we have that you can use. There is a new feature this year, if you haven't seen it yet. Susanna and Hannah are working on this thing called News Goggles. They highlight one key event each week. So last week it was about breaking news alerts and the shooting of Breonna Taylor in Louisville, Kentucky. So they go through these and they sort of give their perspective as journalists. So this is a screenshot from part of the Word document, but they also provide you a Google Slides that you can use with students so you can get their professional insight as journalists into each of these. And you can see those each week in the SIFT as well. And they are doing absolutely incredible work with this. So it is, I believe it's a really amazing resource for you to use. We have an app I mentioned earlier. It's called Informable. It's a brain training style app that teaches 5 specific types of news literacy skills. It is completely free and ad-free on the App Store and iTunes and on Google Play. And if you are a podcast junkie, we have launched a new podcast this year. It's called Is That a Fact? You can go to newslit.org/podcast and listen to it online, or you can also download it from all of the major podcast players. Our colleague Daryl Warland has done incredible work in publishing that. I think we've got 3 issues that have come out so far, maybe 4. It comes out each week on Wednesday. And then finally, NewsLitCamps. This is a day of professional development. They used to be in person. The idea is that we bring together journalists from a news organization and educators from a district where that news organization covers for a day of news literacy professional development, talking about journalism and news literacy. Our next one is specifically for Miami area educators on October 23rd. So if you are in the Miami-Dade area, or if you know someone, this is a free day. It's now virtual. The link to register is there. But we also have our first national NewsLitCamp that we've ever done. We will be doing this. This is open to educators all around the country with the Texas Tribune on December 10th. So we have journalists from the Texas Tribune who are going to be working with us, leading sessions and talking about a lot of these concepts, and especially going into deeper concepts relating to journalism. A shout out if you are interested, if you believe your school district might be interested in doing a NewsLitCamp with us. We have a form here, bit.ly/NLC interest. As with all bit.lys, that is case sensitive. We are looking for school district partners to bring NewsLitCamps. They are free for educators and for school districts. And it is I think it's one of our best professional development efforts that we do. And then finally, this is a link to our online, we have a shared Google Drive folder. A copy of this presentation, a PDF form, is going to be in there along with some other resources for you at bit.ly.newslitpd resources, with the P and the D being capitalized. Again, I believe we're sharing these in the chat, so you can check those out. So finally, just a reminder, our next 3 are coming up each Tuesday. October 13th, going deeper into misinformation, October 20th about digital verification, and October 27th on understanding bias. So the last thing, and we'll go into Q&A from here. Your feedback is very important to us. So if you wouldn't mind taking about 2 to 3 minutes, this link, bit.ly/newslitpd survey, all lowercase letters. This is a short Google form where we need your feedback to help us improve our offerings, to make sure that we are bringing relevant professional development to you and supporting you in ways to make sure that you can integrate news literacy into your teaching. So that brings us to the end. So we're just going to go into I'll stay online for a little bit for some additional Q&A. If people want us to, let's see. How do you get, Rachel asks, how do we get on the NewsLitCamp? We will send out some links for how you can register for them. They will be in a follow-up email, but I believe they'll also be in a Google Doc where you can join. We do some sessions which are broadly about news literacy, but then we have journalists that facilitate sessions specifically relating to things that they do. So I'll stay online for a few minutes to see if anybody has additional questions. Otherwise, that brings us to the end of tonight's session. Thank you very much for your time today and for joining my colleagues and I to talk about this. And we look forward to talking with you again in the next couple of weeks. Okay, I see our participation numbers dwindling. I don't see any new questions, so we're gonna stop here. If you have questions, please feel free to email us. You can reach out to us on social media. You can also email us at pd@newslit.org, and we will try to follow up with you as best we can in the coming days. So thank you very much. Have a wonderful day, and best of luck in everything that you're trying to do to educate your students, and we are here to support you. Thank you.